patience is no mere tarrying, no mere sitting around waiting for something to happen. In this perspective, patience is potentially a state of relational being, is potentially a mode of partaking in recreation, the recreation effected through the passion. Thank you for that most gracious introduction and invitation, and thank you all for being here. I noticed as I was strolling up St. Giles this morning that the talk was advertised under this title, which is a quotation from the very end of the prologue to the Rule of St Benedict. However, when I sent the proposal, I'd added a little word, which is really the content of my talk. So I had cited St. Benedict, by patience we participate in the passion of Christ, and then added colon, how? Question mark, question mark. Working and thinking about this talk, I've been thinking back on a paper that the unforgettable and extraordinary Metropolitan Anthony Bloom wrote in 1973. It's a short autobiographical article simply entitled My Monastic Life, which tells the story of that awakening. Metropolitan Anthony writes in that paper of a deep quest he pursued as a young man, wanting to give himself to God in the church after his conversion, and wanting to pour himself out for God's people, and asking himself, how? And he writes, one day God answered me. I was reading the book of Isaiah, and in the 58th chapter I read this phrase, give your soul in pasture to him who is hungry. Give your soul in pasture to him who is hungry. I was transfixed. I read it again and again and again, and he said there he found the key to what would and should become a Eucharistic existence, of becoming bread in Christ so that his people might be nourished and thrive. So it became the starting point for a crucial orientation of his entire existence. Then, he says, later, I looked again for that passage, and I discovered that in none of the languages accessible to me had Isaiah said anything of the kind. What he says is, nourish the hungry soul. That is, give food to him who is hungry. But, as in so many passages of Scripture one reads, their eyes were closed, so my eyes had been closed to what was printed, and my heart open to what God wanted to make me see. It's an astute observation and the account of an experience that I think many of us, by practicing Lectio Divina, will be able to identify with. Why have I been thinking of this text by Anthony Bloom? Because thinking about this talk, I've been recalling a book that made a great impression on me in my novitiate, that I remember was prominently placed on display in the novitiate library, clearly a volume that our superiors wanted us to read, that carried the beautiful and suggestive, and I think extremely suggestive, a significant title, The Stature of Patience. And that is precisely what I hope to say something about this evening, that patience is not just a matter of dumb endurance, but is an exercise with real stature. And recalling that book is something I've been doing for years, and it's sort of been a motif in my own reflection. And then last week, I thought I'd just reread a couple of passages, so I found it in the Internet Archive and established that it wasn't called that at all. There is no book called The Stature of Patience. It is, in fact, called The Stature of Waiting by W.H. Vanston. But that gives me a sort of way in, because there is an overlap, of course, between waiting and patience. But there is also, I'd say, a distinction. But what exactly is the difference between waiting and patience? I dare say there's a widespread assumption that they're more or less synonymous. We have, in most of our modern languages, I think, largely reduced patience to a state of resigned endurance that would correspond to the Greek and biblical term hypomone, which literally means a remaining underneath, conjuring up the mental image of a yoke, material, relational, marital, or of just being stuck underneath a pile of rubble from a collapsed house. If we think of patience in semantic context and consider some of the derived vocabulary, we'll establish that a patient these days is now largely, in our thinking and imagination, a hapless individual in an NHS queue opening onto infinitude, someone floundering in online forms. 40 years ago, back in the days when Yorkshire Television made international sitcom hits like the series Only When I Laugh, a patient was a disenfranchised ward prisoner submitted to matron's strictures in a state of diagnostic apatheticism, having no idea what failed him. As I was coming into Heathrow the day before yesterday from Oslo, we were circling around London for a very long time, and the pilot finally talked to us and said, "There's a queue, we've just got to be patient," by which he meant there's just nothing we can do. The adjective passive has come to represent a fatalist attitude, a renunciation of agency. To accuse someone of passivity is a supreme indictment. If we turn to another term, passion, well, that has a little more oomph to it, but passion too spells a kind of alienation. For is passion not something that rides us, a subject whose objects we are? Along these lines, patience would appear to spell precisely waiting, an aptitude for sticking it out until it, whatever it is, unravels or ends. That makes me think of a story I heard from one of our Irish communities as an example of monastic consolation, when an old monk had noticed that one of the novices was down in the dumps and really feeling very discouraged, and in order to give him some fresh heart, came up to him in the garden and whispered, "Don't worry, you'll be dead soon." Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, which has been regurgitated tediously by many a less acute imitator, was largely grounded in the assumption that what faith does is this: it deprives imbecile adherents of both the will and the strength to act upon the world, leaving them slaves to the deified projection of their own discouragement. And so one can quite understand why Nietzsche didn't particularly recommend that course. We can, without much difficulty, find evidence to corroborate such aberration, but aberrations they are, causing us to err off several tracks at once: a semantic track, an existential track, and a theological track. At any rate, if and when we consider patience from a Christian perspective, and if we do, it suddenly becomes much more interesting. This becomes clear if we translate ourselves from an English or Anglo-Saxon framework of reference to a Latin framework of reference. At the root of patientia, obviously, is the verb patior, which gives us passio, the term which, to a mind configured to the thought world of the fathers, ancient and medieval, a sense alive in the liturgy, a word that evokes a scene, the passion, a scene at once human and divine, at once datable and transcendent, a scene of such supreme activity that the entire structure of the world is seen to be comprehensible only in reference to it. That the passion is the event that defines reality. As we read in the age-old motto of the supremely patient Carthusian order, stat crux dum volvitur orbis. The cross stands firm while the world turns. The cross, the instrument of the passion, being presented as the axis on which the world turns existentially and hermeneutically. By Christ's saving passion in a Christian optic, the world is renewed, recreated, and that passion, though accomplished in history once for all, that passion remains a present reality and a metaphysical atmosphere in which we are involved as members of Christ's mystical body. The mystical body which is the extension in time of his incarnate and shockingly palpable oblation. There's a passage in the Pensées of Pascal that has haunted me for years, and this time I'm actually going to give you an accurate quotation. And it reads like this: Jesus remains in agony until the end of the world. That isn't time to be slumbered away. Pascal reminds us that this event effected, realized once for all, remains mystically and effectively present here and now, and that we're engaged in it. The virtue of Christian vigilance, the nepsis that the fathers so recommended, has to do with consent to such incorporation into ongoing salvation, is to do with keeping eyes and ears and spiritual senses open to make us recognize the unfolding here and now of the Christic mystery. In this optic, patience is no mere tarrying, no mere sitting around waiting for something to happen. In this perspective, patience is potentially a state of relational being, is potentially a mode of partaking in recreation the recreation effected through the Passion. Gerard Manley Hopkins hints at this in his wonderful Wood Dove poem entitled Peace, in which he, after lamenting the fugitive passage of the wood dove, a figure of the peace he so yearned for and that often escaped him, writes, "O surely reaving peace my Lord should leave in lure some good, and so he does leave patience exquisite that plumes to peace hereafter. And when peace here does house, he comes with work to do. He does not come to coo, he comes to brood and sit." I love that image of patience pluming, transforming a shivering lump of bony flesh into a creature made to soar and to brood, spirit-like, upon the chaos waters of the cosmic and human condition, and then to sit, enabling the eggs to hatch. It is with this sort of stature of patience in mind that St. Benedict of Nursia writes, at the end of the prologue to his Rule, that magnificent mini-treatise of Christian anthropology, that St. Benedict writes with emphatic and beautiful alliteration, "Per patientiam participemur passionibus Christi." By patience we participate in the Passion of Christ. Well, how? I'd like to explore this motif briefly with monastic reference, because, after all, Benedict legislates for a very particular kind of society, but a society which is, to cite a phrase which is sometimes current in monastic literature, is an ecclesiola in ecclesia, a little church in the big church, and which is and forms and constitutes an image of what society might be as such, which is why monastic insight is very often, with not all that much effort, easily and helpfully transferable to other contexts of human coexistence. There are three chief dimensions of patience that we encounter in the Rule: patience with self, patience with others, and patience with God. So I'd like to consider those, as I said, briefly in turn. The Rule of St Benedict, you will remember, begins with a chapter after the prologue that defines the kinds of monks. And there are four such kinds, says St Benedict. You have the hermits, who are trained through community life for solitary combat in the desert. And St. Benedict acknowledges not only the legitimacy, but the admirable dignity of this state, while adding the qualifier that no hermit can set out on his own unless he has first been trained in community. And so he goes on to describe the three forms of community that one might encounter in monastic reality. And they coincide to other types as well of society. There are, he says, the monks who are gyrovagues. Now, a gyrovagus is someone who just walks round and round. In Latin literature, we find the term gyrovagus sometimes referred to an ass who turns a water wheel. that just spends its days walking round and round and round and round the well to pull buckets up, but without ever getting anything to drink itself. So the gyrovague is somebody who errs in the wilderness with no particular set goal, no planned finality, someone who's just seeking a little bit of comfort, a little bit of sustenance, a little bit of company, here and now, for a few days before passing on to somewhere else. So not a particularly admirable type. There is another one that St. Benedict calls Sarabites. No one quite knows what that word really means, but the category of Sarabites is instantly recognizable. For these are monks, says St. Benedict, who are a rule unto themselves. And their way of formulating that rule is very attractive, because anything that pleases them, they call licit, and anything which disagrees with them, they call illicit. Flexible categories, adaptable to circumstance. And these too are unlikely ever to arrive at any sort of fixed or desirable goal. That brings Benedict to the fourth type, which he says is the strong type of the Cenobites, those who opt for a koinos bios, a common life of dispossession, of renouncing self-will and the urge to accumulate stuff, who surrender themselves into the hands of divine providence, made palpably present through the community led by an abbot, and who resolve to stay put in that community, pronouncing what is still one of the Benedictine vows, the vow of stability, which is quite simply a vow not to run away when things get tough. So the monk for whom St. Benedict legislates, the Cenobite, opting for a koinos bios, is a human being on a search for meaning and truth and purpose, who has said to him or herself one fine day, "Enough of this, I will no longer run in circles." So the monk that St. Benedict has in mind is someone who stops and says, I'm going to stay in this place, cost what it may, and I'm going to face my battles here. And those battles are first and foremost interior battles. St. Benedict insists that the chief requirement for anyone wanting to embrace monastic life, after the true desire for God, which is his criterion of vocational discernment, the experiential basis on which that search must unfold is the basis of self-knowledge. And St. Benedict sets out the terms of such progress in self-knowledge primarily in his grand 7th chapter, which is entitled On Humility. Humilitas being that monastic virtue of contact with the humus, the fertile soil, the quality of keeping one's feet on the ground, of renouncing the illusion that one is somehow an angel or some stratospheric being fluttering between heaven and earth, embracing reality as it is and consenting to be rooted in it. The monastic life is very effectively geared towards enabling self-knowledge simply by paring down receptivity and by removing a number of stimuli and outside distractions that normally we turn to for affirmation of our sense of self, or that we utilize in order to project a sense of identity to others. In modern terms, by taking away our telephones, by switching off the radio, by not having a television, by not leaving us constantly exposed to sound and to voices, by giving us something to wear which is not of our own choice, taking away that identity marker that normal clothes represent, making us wear a habit that, to begin with, makes us feel pretty absurd, thereby forcing us to face the interior luggage I carry, mostly in terms of my remembrance. And the beginnings of a monastic novitiate is, to a very large extent, an exercise in patient remembering. Because the more these outside stimuli recede into the background, the quieter my life becomes, we might think, for about a week or two, giving me just the opportunity to savor the delight of finally finding peace before the rumblings within begin. And I start realizing, to my astonishment, how much, in fact, I remember of good things and happy things, and of bad things and ugly things. I come to remember wounds that were inflicted that I thought were healed, but perhaps aren't. I come to remember impressions I've received that I thought I'd left behind. In my own case, I learned how effective and enduring visual memory is. I realized how I remembered scenes from films that weren't particularly nice films, violent scenes that I'd watched as part of quite ordinary run-of-the-mill crime films or whatever, but ugly things that hadn't made an impression on me when I watched them, but which had, for their ugliness, lodged themselves in my remembrance, thereby conditioning my perception. That's a superficial and a banal example, but I think we can easily imagine instances of remembering that are much graver and much harder to endure. And it can be a great temptation for the novice when facing those things, those aspects of luggage that I thought were long since dispatched, to say, this is just too much, and to pull out. That abiding with oneself is the first real austerity that monastic life introduces, which one's got to measure oneself by. St. Gregory the Great, in his Life of Benedict, in the second book of his Dialogues, uses a wonderful phrase describing the beginnings of St. Benedict's solitary existence south of Rome, near Subiaco, when he says, solus habitavit secum. He lived alone with himself. It's a poetic phrase, and rather a lovely phrase, but it also points to an experience of significant hardship. One of the things I discover when I live alone with myself like that, be it in community, is how dictatorial my own preferences are, and how cross I can become when they are crossed, when I can't have what I want, when I can't eat when I want, or perhaps not even have a cup of tea when I want. When I'm surrounded by bells that tell me what to do and when to do it, and I'm expected to turn up. And I find myself locked in a primordial conflict between two values, relative values, the first being that self-will which St. Benedict qualifies as voluntas propria, which doesn't designate initiative, because initiative is good. Voluntas propria, self-will in the vocabulary of Benedict, is that dictatorial command of preference that submits me to it, wanting me to have things my way at any cost. So I'm faced with a conflict between that and another value, which is a real value, which is that of obedientia, of obedience. There's a kind of caricature of the religious monastic life, pretending or presupposing that the religious lives by blind obedience. That is false. Blind obedience is not a Christian virtue or a Christian practice. Christian obedience has always got to be a seeing obedience and a lucid obedience. An obedience based on understanding, founded on a will to pursue a given path in the hope of arriving at a goal that is a supremely desirable goal. And the Benedictine term for obedience, obedientia, is derived from the verb obaudire, which, you can hear it, is to do with the auditive, to do with the listening. So the monk stays still, chooses to stop running in circles, stop running round and round, to cut himself off from what distracts in order to face the memories within, the desires within, the fears within, the dictatorial urges within, and then to let these be qualified in the logic of obedience, of listening out for the word of another. That other being primarily and fundamentally the voice of the loving God who calls him to be free, to grow up, to learn to love freely, to set his love in order, to become a carrier and a messenger of Christ's gospel. In order then to recognize the conflicts that exist between my devout purpose and my human conditioning, and so to set about the serious work of conversion and, where needed, of repentance. What matters in this confrontation with self is then to establish clarity in the sort of voices that claim me, the destructive voices and the constructive voices, the voices that call me to life and the voices that would pull me into death, and then to make a choice, to learn to recognize the life-giving voice and to opt to follow it, to make sure that I develop that capacity that the Lord speaks of in the parable of the Good Shepherd when he says, "My sheep hear and know my voice." They know my voice before they understand what I'm saying. Perhaps they're not even able to understand what I'm saying, but knowing my voice is enough. For this learning to see and learning to listen to take place, great patience with self is required, which is in itself a school of humility, enabling me to see both my own limitations and my sins and the potential I carry and the hope that God has for me. These tenets from the Rule of St Benedict are illustrated in the life of Benedict by St Gregory the Great, when he speaks of St Benedict's endurance of the primal passions, the hunger and thirst and erotic lust that cry out for sensual satisfaction. And when he speaks to us of Benedict's endurance, his active patience, his determination not to run away, to stay, that enables him to orient these vital forces and energies in himself out from a feeding on themselves and an enclosing of Benedict in himself towards an opening outward in charity. And there is a particular scene in the life when St. Benedict, this isn't just by way of preamble, this isn't a practice I would recommend to anyone, but when St. Benedict, in order not to yield to a particularly violent physical temptation, throws himself into a thorn bush, and thereby finding himself so distracted that the temptation lost its force, but thereby showed a degree of fortitude so vast that it was simply too much for the temptation that vanished, enabling St. Benedict from that moment on to become not only a bearer of life for himself, but a source of life for others. And it's extremely significant that at that point in the life, Gregory changes the terminology with which he refers to Benedict, no longer referring to him as a young man, but as a father, that is, someone apt to nurture and generate life in others. These experiences and St. Benedict's teaching show us that concrete experience of my misery, my personal misery, prepares me for an encounter with God's misericordia, with his mercy, which is where my misery intersects with the loving kindness of the heart of God, showing that even what I may perceive as an experience of painful humiliation can become an occasion for grace inasmuch as it grounds me in truth, the truth of who I am and the truth of who God is, the God who is able to save me out of even the ultimate extremity. So much for that patience with self, which is the fundamental and, chronologically speaking, the first challenge the monk faces. Then there is the attitude of patience with others, an exercise that will find its form and its particular accent over time as I come to know the people I live with. A monastic community as a society of individuals who haven't chosen one another on the basis of any particular shared interest or shared sensibility. They share an ultimate goal, the search for God, that is clear, but I think anyone who's had any acquaintance with a religious community over time for any length of time will be struck by the improbable diversity of characters. That can be a source of great enrichment and sometimes of challenge. St. Benedict teaches us the true and right attitude we should assume with regard to our fellow human beings in the way he legislates for the reception of guests. Guests, he says, who are never lacking in a monastery. And let's remember that guests at the time, the 5th, 6th century, weren't primarily devout retreatants wanting a few days of spiritual bliss, but poor people and people on a journey, peregrini, who in Benedict's vocabulary weren't necessarily pilgrims, but simply people who were not living at home, people who were drifting. We might plausibly translate that term by migrants. And it's striking that St. Benedict says the monk's attitude to these comers, whose reasons for knocking on the monastery door may be extremely various, is to be one of supreme openness. The monk who is placed at the gates of St. Benedict is to welcome every guest as if he were Christ himself. And that, if you think about it, is a fairly tall order, because sometimes he comes extremely well disguised. In the chapter on the porter, the senex sapiens, the wise elder, who is old enough to be kept by his infirmity from roaming about too much, and so apt to stay in the guest house, St. Benedict says that as soon as, he says, mox, without any delay at all, when somebody knocks on the door, this wise old man, the representative, the outward face of the monastery, is to respond with the acclamation, Deo gratias, thanks be to God. And then he is to say, Benedic, your blessing. That is, the other, unknown, is to be received not as a perilous stranger, but as a bearer of blessing, as a manifestation of divine providence on whose account it is appropriate and necessary to thank God. This concerns the people who come to the monastery as guests, but that insistence on the search for Christ in the other is every bit as defining of fraternal relations. It's interesting and striking to study the imperatives that St. Benedict employs in order to describe fraternal relations. And I think those are terms that can perfectly well be transferred to family life. He says, the monks should honor one another, console one another when they're sad, encourage one another when they're discouraged, and they should seek to love one another. And he makes a particular provision because that exercise is perhaps of all the most difficult when you live within the structure of monastic communities. They should make an earnest effort to love their abbot. They are to be extremely patient with one another's weaknesses of body and character. And those will appear over time. I think most people who first come to a monastic community to join it will be struck by the transcendent and luminous holiness of the brethren. Well, that impression may not last indefinitely. And St. Benedict even announces the possibility that we may, in the community, encounter false brethren. That is, people who are really troublesome, who for whatever reason, here and now, whether for a season or more permanently, are not playing by the rules, who are deceitful, perhaps even malicious. And he says, that can happen even in a society operating on the basis of high ideals. You may encounter human hurt and hurtful realities for which there is no excuse. But be prepared for that as well, and be prepared to bear and to pardon. Throughout St. Benedict's teaching, we find an equilibration of two commands that St. Paul gives in the final chapter of the Epistle to the Galatians. For years I've been fascinated by the complementarity of those two commands, when at the beginning he says, Let them bear one another's burdens. And I think we will all recognize that as a necessary and a noble tenet of Christian living, of ecclesial living. But then have you noticed that a little further on, about 5 verses further on, he says, and let each carry his own load. And one presupposes the other. I must first, as we considered a moment ago, embrace that patience with myself and assume what is mine as mine, and have the honesty and the humility to say, well, this is the stuff I carry. This is the history that has conditioned me. These are the gifts and the deprivations that have formed me as I am. Only when that basis of truthfulness is in place can I constructively let myself be carried in such a way that I don't simply project my own awkwardnesses and difficulties onto others and blame others for them, but I will let myself be helped, and I will be able to perform that same helping role with regard to others. St. Benedict knew from experience what patience with others might cost. His own monastic life began in solitude. Then he was discovered by a nearby community of monks who were short of a superior and who thought to themselves, well, here's one who seems very good, and he's clearly very serious and very with it, and he's well motivated. So let's ask him to be their abbot. The trouble is, they hadn't reckoned with just how serious St. Benedict was. And when he started challenging some of their practices, they didn't like it much at all. So they thought there's only one way out of this, and that was to poison his wine. Now, by a glorious miracle, which you can read about in the life of Benedict by Gregory, you can see how that ruse was discovered and how Benedict used the opportunity to address a word of admonition to his brethren, but without any bitterness and without anger, saying simply, listen, if this is how you want to live, fine. But my path is another path, and I'm intent on pursuing it because the Lord calls and the gospel dictates. So we shall part company here in peace. But when he talks about being exposed to false brothers, well, he knew what he was talking about. But there's another dimension to this patience with others, not just putting up with them, but consenting to assume a part of their burden. And that brings us to a dimension of monastic living which is foundational in the early literature. Athanasius says of St. Anthony the Great that he suffered with the suffering. Tois pascusin sine pasce. That is, he didn't only say, oh, poor you, my poor fellow, I'm so sorry, and here's £1, and then go home, but he consented in Christian charity, in the sacramental communion of the mystical body, to assume as his own and to co-carry the weight of others. That is an exercise which prompts and enables a growth in supernatural charity and constitutes an exercise in non-self-referential living, which is the key, really, to this form of patience, non-self-referential living. You might even call it a pedagogy of ecstasy, of turning out of the limitations of my own self and my own experience towards an opening to the other in openness and charity in patience. Finally, the third kind of patience, patience with God. I've spoken about St. Benedict's instruction on how visitors and peregrini are to be welcomed with supreme kindness and gentleness, with thanksgiving and a request for a blessing, and an explicit effort to recognize in them Christ himself. It's interesting to note that his attitude to postulants, that is, the young idealists who come and say, I'd like to join this monastery, please, is quite different. Such seekers, says St. Benedict, are to be welcomed, yes, but they are to be kept waiting for a good few days outside, sleeping rough, or having to go to find an inn somewhere nearby, then to make the effort to come back and knock again and to repeat the request. Because to come as a guest is one thing, to ask to be admitted into this covenantal society is another. And for that, a great firmness of purpose is called for, and that must be tested from day one, because if you haven't got a good portion of firmness of purpose, well, the whole thing will be just a frustrating nonsense waste of time for yourself and for the community. So they are to be tested for the seriousness of purpose. Then it is to be made clear to them at once that the school of the Lord's service, which is what St. Benedict calls the monastery, imparts lessons over a very long haul, and that presupposes courageous perseverance. The rule is to be read through to the novice 3 times in its entirety during his year of novitiate, says St. Benedict, if the fellow can't read himself, so that he knows very well what exactly it is to which he commits himself. If he doesn't want to do that, or if he finds he doesn't have the strength for that commitment, that is no problem at all. And we shall depart in peace as friends. But once he has committed himself, says St. Benedict, he must recognize that he is held to this standard of living, usque ad mortem, until he breathes his last. So he wants a great testing of the seriousness of purpose. For a meaningful, intentional, and purposeful Christian community does presuppose that. A sense of purpose, a clear sense of finality, and a resolve to remain faithful in the pursuit of it. Only in that way will God be able to act in individual lives and in the life of the community. God, of course, can intervene in history and in biographies any way he pleases. And the lives of the saints give us many examples of lightning change. They happen. They're not terribly rare, but they're not the norm. The norm for spiritual growth and for conversion, for most of us, is the norm of any organic growth, and that is slow. None of us, even with all the technical gadgets we have at our disposal, can pull a carrot out of the ground to force it to grow at greater speed. So St. Benedict puts before the novice life as an exodus from the present Egypt of my captivity in self-will and preference and dictatorial self-seeking to the ecstatic vision of God on his holy mountain, proceeding all the while in the company of the new Israel which the community represents. The more I read and live with the itinerary of Benedict, the more I'm fascinated by a detail in his life that occurs towards the end, when Benedict, after having begun his monastic life at Subiaco, served for a while as superior at Nicovaro, where they tried to poison him, then spent some time looking for a new place to settle, then establishes himself on Monte Casino, where he remains, where a monastery is built, a rule is written, foundations are made, and everything seems stable, where God grants him a vision of the future that shows the destruction of Monte Casino by Vandals. And this vision is in fact realized a generation after St. Benedict's death. And I find that very striking, that he pursues his enterprise of foundation and formation in the providential certainty that nothing, or at least very little, will materially remain. Being reminded that what he is called to construct is not a monument to self, but a school of Christian living and an apt temple from which the divine praises will rise. So that patience with God presupposes a liberation from personal accomplishment, a consent to contingency, to being clay in God's hands, which is a work of constant reformation of myself and of my insertion into the community. So those are the three chief dimensions of monastic patience, with self, with others, with God, that configure this participation in the passion of Christ. And with that, I will now wrap up. Because we have before us then an image of the monk as an embodied, incarnate, personal seat of intersection of a horizontal and a vertical axis. The horizontal axis of community building, of coexistence with other human subjects, and the vertical axis of God's gracious presence, presented in St. Benedict's parlance as deificum lumen, as the light that divinizes. And the point of intersection is the individual monk's pierced heart, and a precondition for living monastically, for living as a Christian radically, is a consent to the realization of that piercing in me. We find a visual representation, which many of you will have seen, in Bernini's great and famous sculpture of the Transverberation of St. Teresa of Avila, which you can see in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. A work of art which is often presented in the literature as an eroticization of the mystery of patience. There is that aspect to Bernini's sculpture, but that not in a superficial or passionate sense, but because this mystery of transfixing does have a nuptial dimension. It is caught up in Christ's spousal sacrifice for his church. But the transfixing is lodged first and foremost in the extreme realization of Christ's self-emptying, his kenosis, which does indicate the oblative dimension that is never lacking in Christian love, however imbued it may be with warm and even with erotic affection. When St. Paul writes to the Corinthians, he says, "I preached nothing among you except Christ crucified." The crucifixion and the image of the crucified represents for us as Christians an ongoing scandal, because it shows the immobilization through human agency of him who is the very principle of motion. But precisely thereby, we are shown the icon of patience as the scene of supreme activity, reminded that the shepherd who leads us is at one and the same time the Lamb of sacrifice, that he who is Pontifex, supreme high priest, is at the same time the victim. Because the head is in the body, and the body is in the head, as Augustine would say, and did say again and again in his preaching particularly on the Psalms, reminding us of the great importance of remaining alert to these Augustinian symphonies, recognizing the work of the pontifex when we may be providentially assigned to a state of victimhood in the most objective sense, and recognizing the shepherd in the lamb. This gives us a complex and paradoxical vision of reality and of the realization of human potential, a human potential that can't be conveyed propositionally only, and that calls for examples and exemplars. And that is why monastic formation is in essence mimetic. It's to do with imitating a credible example. Cling to the just man. That is a quotation from the Psalms that we find again and again in the early monastic lives, and we find a resonance in it in St. Paul's imitate me. And I will end on this note, because I believe what we need more than anything else in the church and the world now is the perseverance of credibly living embodiments of patience, credible examples of Christian life, love, virtue, and sacrifice. And I'll conclude with a passage from a text that is very dear to me. It is the first sermon on Advent by Erik of Varden, one of the first generation of Cistercians born in 1070, who died in 1157, who speaks precisely of the stature of patience. Erik says, "In case our faith should cool or our patience become sultry through the delay of our hope, when what we expect doesn't immediately come about, and we start to side with those who believe for a time but fall away in time of trouble," plenty of examples of that, "he who grants faith tests what he has granted and crowns what he has tested and cries to us from heaven, 'Let him who would believe not be in a hurry.' Not be in a hurry to see what he believes. For if we hope for something we do not see, then we exercise patience in waiting. Through Hosea, the Lord gives an order to the bride whom he has taken to himself in troth, saying, 'You will be waiting for me many days, but you are not to take any other husband or lover.' This is the proper way of waiting for the Lord, keeping his troth. Even though we may miss the consolation of his presence, we must not look about adulterously, but wait in suspense for his return. The Lord says this in the same prophet, 'The people will wait in suspense for my return.' Fitting it is indeed that the people should be in suspense, as it were, between heaven and earth, unable as yet to grasp heavenly affairs, but preferring even so not to have any contact with those of earth. And if at any time they should make contact with those of earth, it is only with the very tips of their fingers, I mean the most outward parts of the soul, and then on account of the necessities of corrupted nature, which we are forced to minister to as long as creation is subject, however unwilling, to such external formalities." So Erik imagines the Christians as suspended between heaven and earth, as an icon of patience and as a bridge between the two. And he says, "My soul does choose this suspense, and my bones do choose such a suspended death, to make them persevere in suspension from this cross, until I merit to die upon it, in order to enter into life." This is an image of patient life, of the stature of patience, conformed to the mystery of Christ's saving passion, which is a dolorous mystery, but also a joyful mystery. as we sing so audaciously on Good Friday, per lignum venit gaudium in universo mundo. By the wood of the cross, by the passion, joy has entered the whole world. This is the patience to which we're called, which is not just a sitting it out, but a participation. And we might learn from the French language, which has had the ingeniousness of making of the exercise of patience a verb. One can say patienter and point towards a positive experience. Seen in such a light, patience, Christ-conformed patience, does have stature, even though the phrase does not exist as a book title. And it really does renew the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Erik, for such an illuminating and a convicting talk about patience. We have about 10 minutes for questions around. I could ask you what people are thinking of their question. That last quotation, in some ways, perhaps it suggests that the difference between enduring suffering and being patient in suffering. Is there a difference? Endurance and patience. You suggested a more active, positive character, I think, than just simply gritting one's teeth.
Yeah, well, I think we could say that both endurance and patience are intentional, but patience is inflamed with a heartfelt yes, which is not just acceptance, but wanting.
And the yes is for what? What is saying yes to?
Precisely to that Christocentric participation, which is a yes. To refer to that other mysterious Pauline word of fulfilling what is lacking in Christ's suffering for the world's salvation, which is not to suggest that the sacrifice brought is insufficient, but pointing to that Paschalian awareness that it is still unfolding and that we are part of it.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. The microphone will appear just here. And I'll go back.
Thank you very much. I have a question about hope. How the virtue of hope the theological virtue of hope is related to the virtue of patience.
Well, it is obviously it's presupposed, and it's really valuable that you make that connection. Because I always like to make this point that we talk about patience, and patience presupposes circumstances that are trying, perhaps painful, but we must always be on our guard as Christians to idealize pain. Pain is always an anomaly, and it shouldn't be there. It goes against the divine purpose, which is one of fulfillment and flourishing. But we can say yes to pain for a time, longer or shorter, in the certainty that it is purposeful, and that, I think, is the exercise of hope.
Okay, I'm just going to have a quick scan. See some questions, yes? I see
That's
back
the
here.
At the back there.
Yeah, so we're going to go all the way to the back.
Thank you. Could you please say a word or two about the word stature? When I hear the word stature, I think of there's a physicality there. Is there a way in which we embody patience? What does that look like, physically speaking?
I think the reason why that phrase has stuck with me is because, to say of someone, he's a person of stature, is to say that that person has grown towards a realization of full measure, to speak more biblically, and has shown a realization of human and divine potential. And then I like it because it suggests as it were, the uprightness of patience, because we can so easily have, at least I'm prone to that, to think of patience as something that one is cowed underneath, that presses one down. And that is also why I love that image of Erik Varden that I ended with, where in fact the stature of patience is manifest as an extension of human reality heavenward, making of the human being a kind of an incarnate Jacob's ladder. But those are purely subjective associations.
Thank you so much. I want to ask about the nuptial or erotic participation in ecstasy, kind of happening in the wood of the cross, seem to be in the wood or the sacrifice of the cross. I want to move backwards maybe a little bit from that at the initial point of asceticism, when a person has to rechannel or resublimate desire to kind of participate. What would you say Benedict has to say about that? And I think our culture is at a moment struggling to find that asceticism, struggling to find the way in to how that could be human flourishing, to actually resublimate. And I'm thinking particularly about like the hydraulic metaphor for desire that runs all the way through kind of classical philosophy, through Christianity, that we rechannel these kinds of disordered, little rivers and bring them all into one stream of love. I just want to get your comments on how the Benedictine vision you've cast can help us do that.
Good question. Well, I'd say, first of all, it calls for a chastising of vocabulary, because obviously when the fathers use nuptial imagery and nuptial metaphors to speak of the relationship between Christ and his church, and to speak of the mystery of communion sacramentally enacted in the Eucharist, that represents the sacrifice of Calvary, they are themselves grounded in a biblically established terminology, based principally on the Song of Songs, and then on the ecclesiological exegesis of St. Paul. So, first of all, we must make sure that we don't present or presuppose a too facile interconnectedness, and recover, as it were, the sacramental and reverential depth of this passionate vocabulary. In St. Benedict himself, we don't really find that aspect present. Obviously, the only writing we have from his hand is the Rule, and as far as I can think of now, anyway, I don't think we can say that there are explicit resonances of a nuptial mysticism there. But it comes into play early enough. Obviously, we have it already in Origen, who isn't a Benedictine reference, but who was read by many of the great Benedictines from Benedict's own generation onward. And then we find it developed in commentaries on the Song of Songs, and in hymns and prayers, reaching a sort of supreme flourishing in the Middle Ages, notably in that famous cycle of sermons on the Song of Songs by St. Bernard of Clairvaux that was completed by Gilbert of Hoyland. So we're dealing with the intersection of two thought worlds, an intersection that was realized very carefully and very gradually. How to bring that into today's parlance, I haven't got an easy answer or a straightforward answer. I think the most important thing we can do is to immerse ourselves in this tradition intelligently and patiently, and then to let it resound chastely within our own time's very confused discourse on desire.
Two quick questions, if they were super quick. Okay, there were two questions I saw hands at the very back. Andrew, if you ask yours, come here, and that's it. We'll hear the questions, and then Bishop Erik will give us a quick answer.
My question is, does your vision of patience have a countervailing, contrasting virtue that is almost an opposite? To give an example from the world of business, it was always used to say, well, you've got to stick at your business. Rome wasn't built in a day. Whereas some recent studies have said, what's the one common denominator of successful entrepreneurs among all the qualities? It's the ability to spot when they're going down a blind alley, flogging a dead horse, banging their head against a brick wall. So is there a countervailing virtue that we should also be cultivating in addition to patience?
Thank you.
Patience stands for the stability and perseverance. It needs to be flanked and guided by conversion, which is a constant turning towards a desired finality. I think there is a nice dialectic of complementarity in the two Benedictine vows of stability, which is basically a vow of patience, and the vow conversatio morum, which is a vow of conversion. So one is a resolve not to run away, and the other one is a resolve never to stand still.
Thank you. So perhaps along the same lines, about monastic profession being something like, well, waiting for the Lord many days, but also at the same time, the one who professes vows saying at that time, well, I'm espoused to him in heaven, whom I've loved with all my heart on earth. Could you talk about what that second aspect involves, what it means that here on earth, the one who professes vows says that, which is a claim, I guess, less about waiting and patience as possessing something already now.
Would you mind just repeating the phrase that you cited?
I am espoused to him in heaven, whom I have loved with all my heart on earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, to some extent, that just points towards the relative unimportance between those two states. That the life of that eternal life isn't something that we're waiting to begin later on, when we shall find ourselves in a different kind of embodiment, but it is inaugurated here and now and effective here and now, and that is why an anticipation of the reward is already palpable and humanly perceptible here and now. And I think we find that in many accomplished monastic lives I think that's a good note to end on. I think of a particular monastic life that's been remains a great inspiration to me, which is that of Sister Mary David Totar, who was a Benedictine of St. Cecilia's Ride, who died relatively young of cancer, and whose great motto towards the end was that of acceptance with love, which is a manifestation of patience. But she wrote a message to her sisters shortly before her death, and she said, "Truly, life here with you has been a piece of heaven." And as I said, it just speaks of the fact that one enclosure leads naturally into the next. Quite as some of the fathers would say that the original enclosure of the Garden of Eden would lead mankind towards the back wall by means of a pleasant walk, only to enable him to discover there an open door that would take him straight into the next without the inconvenience of dying.
Bishop Erik, thank you for such an illuminating, inspirational talk about patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much.